I never thought a portable generator would become the catalyst for the most insane neighborhood war I'd ever witnessed. But then again, I'd never dealt with Brenda Patterson before. My name is Oliver Kensington, and I'm a software engineer who moved to the quiet subdivision of Meadowbrook Estates in Columbus, Ohio, about 3 years ago. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first: neat lawns, friendly waves from passing neighbors, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked straight from a home improvement magazine. What I didn't realize was that our HOA president, Brenda Patterson, ran the place like her own personal fiefdom, and she was about to make my life a living nightmare over something as simple as trying to keep my pipes from freezing. It started in early January 2026, when meteorologists began warning about a polar vortex heading straight for the Midwest. I'm talking about the kind of cold that makes your face hurt the second you step outside, the kind that turns your breath into instant ice crystals. The forecast called for temperatures to plummet to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills reaching -35. They were warning everyone to prepare for possible power outages due to the strain on the electrical grid. I've always been the type to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Maybe it comes from growing up in rural Montana, where losing power in winter wasn't just an inconvenience, but could actually be life-threatening. So when I heard about the incoming storm, I drove straight to the hardware store and purchased a heavy-duty portable generator, along with enough fuel to keep it running for several days if necessary. I also stocked up on bottled water, non-perishable food, and extra blankets. My wife Sarah was visiting her sister in Phoenix for the week, lucky her, so I was riding out this storm solo. I spent the day before the freeze checking our home's insulation, wrapping exposed pipes, and making sure everything was secure. My next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who'd lived in Meadowbrook for 20 years, saw me working and came over to chat. "Smart thinking, Oliver," he said, watching me secure the generator on my covered back porch. "I remember the ice storm of '09. We were without power for 5 days. Pipes burst in half the houses on the street." "Yeah, I'm not taking any chances," I replied, double-checking the fuel levels. "This generator can power the essentials furnace, refrigerator, and a few lights. Should be enough to keep things from freezing up if we lose power." Frank nodded approvingly. "Wish I'd thought to get one myself. Too old to be dragging something like that around now." "Tell you what," I said, "if the power goes out and you need help, come knock on my door. We'll figure something out." The old man smiled gratefully and headed back to his house. I went inside, satisfied that I'd done everything I could to prepare. I had no idea that my preparedness was about to trigger a cascade of events that would expose just how petty and vindictive Brenda Patterson could be. The polar vortex hit Columbus with a vengeance on Friday evening. I watched the thermometer on my back deck drop from 20 degrees at dinner time to 5 degrees by 9 o'clock. By midnight, it was -8 and still falling. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and sending snow swirling in violent eddies across the frozen landscape. I was settled in for the night, reading a book by the fireplace, when the power went out at 1:15 in the morning. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The sudden silence was eerie. No hum from the refrigerator, no gentle whoosh from the heating vents, nothing but the wind outside. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the back porch, where I'd strategically placed the generator. It was a quality unit, one of those inverter models that's designed to run relatively quietly. But still, I knew it would make some noise. I checked to make sure it was positioned well away from the house. You can't be too careful about carbon monoxide, and pulled the starter cord. It roared to life on the second try, settling into a steady hum. Within minutes, I had the essential circuits transferred over. The furnace kicked on with a reassuring whoosh, and a few lights flickered back to life. I wasn't running full power, I didn't need every light in the house blazing, but I had enough to keep things functional and, most importantly, keep the pipes from freezing. I checked on Frank next door, trudging through the knee-deep snow to knock on his door. He answered bundled in what looked like 3 sweaters and a bathrobe. "Power's out over here too," he said, teeth chattering slightly. "Come on over if you get too cold," I offered. "I've got the generator running and plenty of space." "I'll be all right for now," he insisted, but I could tell he was already feeling the chill. "Got the fireplace going and plenty of blankets, but I appreciate the offer, son." I headed back to my house, satisfied that I'd at least checked on him. The generator hummed steadily on the back porch, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I settled back in by the fireplace and eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch. The pounding on my front door woke me at 7 in the morning. Disoriented, I stumbled to the entrance and peered through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a woman I recognized immediately: Brenda Patterson, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood enforcer. She was in her late 40s, with hair dyed an unnatural shade of blonde and pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Even through the distortion of the peephole, I could see the fury on her face. I opened the door, and a blast of Arctic air hit me like a physical force. The temperature had dropped to -12 overnight. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral despite being woken up at this ungodly hour. "You absolutely can help me," Brenda snapped, her breath forming angry clouds in the frigid air. "You can turn off that generator immediately. It's been making noise all night and it's completely unacceptable." I blinked, trying to process this. "The power's out. I'm running the generator to keep my pipes from freezing." "I don't care what you're running it for," she said, her voice rising. "It's against HOA regulations to operate machinery that creates excessive noise. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws clearly states that residents may not operate equipment that disturbs the peace and quiet of the neighborhood." "Brenda, it's -12 degrees outside. Without heat, pipes freeze and burst. I'm sure the bylaws have an exception for emergencies." "There is no exception," she interrupted, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what I assumed was a digital copy of the HOA rules. "Here it is, right here. No generators, compressors, or similar mechanical equipment shall be operated in a manner that creates noise levels exceeding 60 decibels as measured from the nearest property line. Your generator is clearly violating this rule." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Did you actually measure the decibel level, or are you just assuming it's too loud?" Her face flushed red. "I don't need to measure it. I can hear it from my house and that's enough. Turn it off immediately or I'll have no choice but to fine you." "Brenda, be reasonable. The power company said outages could last for days. If I turn off the generator, my pipes will freeze. Do you understand how expensive that damage would be?" "That's not my problem," she said coldly. "You should have prepared better. Maybe invested in better insulation or pipe heating cables. But you can't just violate HOA rules because you didn't plan ahead." The irony of her accusing me of not planning ahead when I was literally the only person in the neighborhood who'd bought a generator wasn't lost on me. But I could see there was no reasoning with her. "I'm not turning it off," I said firmly. "This is a matter of protecting my property from serious damage. I'm happy to discuss this after the emergency is over, but right now, my priority is keeping my house from being destroyed." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice. You'll be receiving a citation and a fine. And if you continue to operate that generator, the fines will continue to accumulate. $500 per day. $500. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're going to fine me $500 a day for protecting my house during a power outage. The rules apply to everyone, Oliver. No exceptions. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, slipping slightly on the ice but catching herself before she fell. I stood there in the doorway, cold air pouring in, absolutely stunned. I'd known Brenda was strict about the HOA rules. She'd cited people for having their garbage cans visible from the street on non-collection days. And she'd once made a neighbor repaint their shutters because the color was allegedly not on the approved list. But this was beyond petty. This was genuinely dangerous. I closed the door and immediately called my buddy Marcus, who was a real estate attorney in downtown Columbus. He didn't answer. It was Saturday morning. After all, so I left a voicemail explaining the situation and asking if the HOA could legally fine me for running a generator during a power emergency. The generator continued to hum on my back porch, and I wasn't about to turn it off regardless of Brenda's threats. I spent the morning monitoring the situation, checking news reports about the power outage. According to the local station, over 40,000 homes in the Columbus area were without power, and restoration efforts were being hampered by the extreme cold and continued high winds. They were estimating it could be anywhere from 24 to 72 hours before power was fully restored. Around noon, I checked on Frank again. The old man looked worse than he had earlier, shivering despite the multiple layers he was wearing. "Frank, you need to come to my house," I insisted. "It's too cold here." "Don't want to be a burden," he mumbled, but he didn't put up much resistance when I helped him gather a few things and led him next door. Once inside my warm house, he practically melted with relief. "Lord, that feels good," he said, holding his hands up to the heating vent. Didn't realize how cold I'd gotten until just now. I made us both hot coffee and sandwiches, and we settled in to wait out the storm. Frank told me stories about the neighborhood's history, including some interesting tidbits about Brenda Patterson. "She moved in about 7 years ago," Frank explained, nursing his coffee. "Divorced, 2 adult kids who never visit. She threw herself into the HOA like it was her life's mission. Got herself elected president within a year, and she's been making everyone miserable ever since." "Has anyone ever challenged her?" I asked. "Oh, sure. A few folks have tried, but Brenda's got a core group of supporters, mostly other busybodies who like having someone to enforce their vision of how the neighborhood should be. Plus, most people just don't want to deal with the hassle. It's easier to keep your head down and follow her rules than to fight back." "Well, she picked the wrong person to mess with this time," I muttered. "There's no way I'm paying fines for protecting my property during an emergency." Frank chuckled. "Good for you, son. Someone needs to stand up to her." That evening, I received an email from Brenda with an official HOA violation notice attached. The subject line read, "Citation, Unauthorized Generator Operation." The document was surprisingly formal, complete with references to specific bylaw sections, the date and time of the violation, and the penalty $500 per day until the violation was remedied. What really got me was the final paragraph. "Failure to comply with this citation may result in additional penalties, including legal action to compel compliance and the placement of a lien on your property to secure payment of outstanding fines." She was threatening to put a lien on my house over running a generator during a winter storm emergency. I forwarded the email to Marcus with a note asking him to call me as soon as possible. Sunday morning brought no improvement in either the temperature or the power situation. It was -15 degrees, and the utility company had revised their estimate. Some areas might not have power restored until Tuesday or even Wednesday. The strain on the system had been worse than anticipated, and repair crews were working around the clock, but struggling with the dangerous conditions. I was making breakfast when there was another knock on the door. This time it was a Columbus police officer, looking cold and thoroughly annoyed at having to be out in this weather. "Oliver Kensington," he asked when I opened the door. "That's me. Is something wrong?" "I received a complaint about a noise violation. Someone named Brenda Patterson called it in." He looked down at his notes. "Said you're operating a generator in violation of neighborhood rules." I explained the situation: the power outage, the sub-freezing temperatures, the need to keep the pipes from freezing. The officer listened patiently, occasionally nodding. "Sir, I understand the HOA's position," he said when I finished, "but honestly, this isn't a police matter. HOA disputes are civil issues. You'd need to work that out through the courts or mediation. As for noise violations, we do have city ordinances, but they typically don't apply to emergency equipment used during power outages. My advice: keep running your generator if you need it. The HOA can complain all they want, but I'm not going to cite you for protecting your property during a legitimate emergency." Relief washed over me. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate you coming out here in this weather to check on it." He smiled tiredly. "Just doing my job." "Stay warm, and hopefully the power will be back on soon." After he left, I felt vindicated. Even the police thought Brenda was being ridiculous, but I also knew this wasn't over. Brenda didn't strike me as the type to back down just because she'd been told she was wrong. I was proven right about an hour later when I saw her marching up my driveway again, this time accompanied by two other people I recognized from the neighborhood: Susan Chambers and Robert Mitchell, both members of the HOA board. All three of them looked furious. "The police won't help you," Brenda announced when I answered the door. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of our rules. This is your final warning. Turn off the generator or we'll be forced to take more serious action." "What kind of action?" I challenged. "The police said this is a civil matter and that I'm not violating any city ordinances." "What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Susan spoke up, her voice shrill. "We have the authority to enter your property and remove the generator ourselves if necessary." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "No, you absolutely do not. That would be trespassing and theft. Try it and I'll call the police right back here, and this time you'll be the ones getting cited." Robert, who seemed slightly less confident than the two women, cleared his throat. "Look, Oliver, we're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Surely you can understand that." "What I understand," I interrupted, "is that you're prioritizing an arbitrary noise complaint over protecting people's homes from serious damage. Do you realize what happens when pipes freeze and burst? We're talking about thousands of dollars in damage, potential flooding, mold issues. And you want me to risk all of that because someone doesn't like hearing a generator running? Other people are managing just fine without generators," Brenda snapped. "Why should you get special treatment?" "I'm not asking for special treatment. Anyone who wants to run a generator should be able to during an emergency like this. In fact, you know what? You should all be running generators if you have them. This is exactly the kind of situation they're designed for." Brenda's face was turning an alarming shade of red. "We'll see what our attorney has to say about this. You haven't heard the last of this, Oliver." They left and I closed the door, my heart pounding. Frank had been watching the whole exchange from the living room. "She's really got it out for you now," he observed. "Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual. Marcus finally called me back Sunday afternoon." I explained everything that had happened: Brenda's demands, the police visit, the threats from the HOA board. "Okay, first of all, you're absolutely in the right here," Marcus assured me. "Ohio law specifically protects homeowners who need to take reasonable measures to protect their property during emergencies. Running a generator during a power outage in sub-freezing temperatures is textbook reasonable. Second, the HOA can write you citations all day long, but those fines aren't going to hold up in court. Any judge is going to side with you on this." "What about the threat to put a lien on my property?" I asked. "They can try, but again, it won't hold up. You'd have grounds to sue them for harassment and possibly even for any damages you incur as a result of their actions. My advice: document everything. Take photos, save all emails and communications, keep records of the weather conditions and power outage duration. If they do try to fine you or take legal action, we'll have plenty of ammunition to fight back." I felt better after talking to Marcus, but I was also getting angry. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous Brenda's position seemed. She was so fixated on enforcing her interpretation of the rules that she couldn't see the forest for the trees. Monday brought a slight warming trend. The temperature climbed all the way up to -5 degrees. The power was still out, though, and the utility company was now saying Tuesday evening at the earliest for restoration in our area. My generator had been running for over 60 hours straight, faithfully keeping my house warm and my pipes unfrozen. I ventured out to check on some of the other neighbors, curious to see how they were faring. The houses on either side of Frank's were dark and clearly without power. I knocked on a few doors, and the people who answered all looked cold and miserable. One couple, the Hendersons, had decamped to a hotel downtown. Another family had gone to stay with relatives in Cincinnati. When I got to Brenda's house, I noticed something interesting. Unlike most of the other houses, which showed signs of occupancy, cars in driveways, occasional movement visible through windows, Brenda's house looked completely dead. No lights, obviously, but also no signs of anyone dealing with the cold. No one bringing in firewood. No one checking on things. Her car was in the garage, but I wondered if maybe she'd left too. That question was answered Monday evening when she showed up at my door yet again. This time, she looked less put together than before. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled, and she was wearing a heavy parka that had seen better days. "I need to speak with you," she said, her tone less aggressive than before but still cold. "What is it now?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. "I wanted to inform you that the HOA board held an emergency meeting this afternoon. We've decided to pursue legal action to compel you to cease operating your generator. You'll be receiving formal notice within the next few days." I stared at her. "You held an emergency meeting about my generator while half the neighborhood is still without power and dealing with dangerous cold. Don't you people have anything better to do? The rules exist for a reason," she said stiffly. "We can't just ignore them whenever it's inconvenient." "This isn't about inconvenience, Brenda. This is about survival. This is about protecting property. Why can't you see that?" For just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face: doubt, maybe, or uncertainty. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual rigid determination. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," she repeated, then turned and walked away. I watched her go, shaking my head in disbelief. How could someone be so stubbornly wrong about something so obvious? Tuesday morning, the temperature finally climbed above 0+2 degrees, to be exact. It felt almost balmy compared to what we'd been enduring. More importantly, the utility company announced that they were making good progress on repairs and expected to have most areas back online by evening. Sure enough, At around 4 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, my power flickered back on. I heard cheers from some of the neighboring houses, and I couldn't blame them. 76 hours without power in some of the coldest weather Ohio had seen in decades was no joke. I let the generator run for another hour to make sure the power was stable, then shut it down and switched everything back over to utility power. The sudden silence was almost jarring after days of the constant hum. Frank, who'd been staying with me the whole time, clasped my shoulder gratefully. "Can't thank you enough, Oliver. Don't know what I would have done without your help." "Happy to do it," I said sincerely. "That's what neighbors are for." Frank headed back to his own house to assess any damage and start getting things back to normal. I did a thorough inspection of my own property and was relieved to find everything in good shape. No frozen pipes, no damage from the cold, nothing. The generator had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Over the next few days, I started hearing stories from around the neighborhood. Not everyone had been as lucky as I was. The Smiths 3 houses down had a pipe burst in their bathroom, causing significant water damage. The Johnsons across the street had experienced a frozen pipe in their crawl space that cracked, though luckily they'd discovered it before it caused too much damage. At least 7 houses in Meadowbrook Estates had experienced some level of freeze-related damage, with repair costs ranging from a few $100s to tens of thousands. And then I heard about Brenda. I was getting my mail on Friday afternoon when Frank came hurrying over, looking like he had some juicy gossip to share. "Oliver, you're not going to believe this," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "Brenda Patterson had her pipes freeze. 3 of them burst, one in the master bathroom, one in the kitchen, and one in the basement. Her whole house is torn up." I felt a mix of emotion, satisfaction that karma had struck, but also genuine sympathy for anyone dealing with that kind of damage. When did she find out? Wednesday morning, apparently. She'd been staying somewhere else during the worst of the cold, a friend's house that had power. When she came back and the power was on, she turned on a faucet and water started spraying everywhere. The plumber said the damage is extensive. Could cost her 15, maybe 20,000 to fix everything properly. I whistled low. That was serious money. That's rough even for her. "Gets better," Frank continued. "She's been calling around trying to get it fixed, but every plumber in Columbus is booked solid for weeks. Everyone's dealing with the same problem. She might not get it properly repaired until March." I tried not to feel too much schadenfreude, but it was difficult. This was exactly what I'd been trying to prevent by running my generator, exactly what I'd tried to warn her about. And she'd been so fixated on enforcing her rules that she'd neglected to protect her own property. The following Tuesday, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. I opened it with a sense of dread, expecting the threatened legal action. Instead, I found something entirely unexpected. The letter informed me that the HOA was dropping all citations and fines related to my generator usage. Furthermore, the board had scheduled an emergency meeting to review and potentially revise the bylaws related to emergency equipment operation. Homeowners were invited to attend and provide input. I called Marcus immediately. "Did you have something to do with this?" He laughed. "I may have sent them a strongly worded letter explaining exactly how weak their legal position was and how much they'd end up paying in legal fees if they pursued this. I also may have mentioned that you'd be well within your rights to countersue for harassment and emotional distress." But the decision to back down was all theirs. "Marcus, you're the best. Just doing my job, but Oliver, go to that meeting. Make sure they actually change those bylaws so this doesn't happen to someone else in the future." I absolutely planned to attend. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I marked it on my calendar and started making notes about what I wanted to say. When Thursday rolled around, I was surprised by the turnout. The clubhouse was packed with homeowners, way more than usually attended HOA meetings. Apparently, word had spread about the generator controversy and the subsequent freeze damage throughout the neighborhood, and people wanted to have their say. Brenda was there, sitting at the head table with the other board members. She looked tired and stressed, and I noticed her hands were covered in small bandages, probably from cleaning up the water damage in her house. When she called the meeting to order, her voice lacked its usual authoritative bite. "Thank you all for coming," she began, shuffling some papers in front of her. "As you know, we're here to discuss potential revisions to our bylaws regarding emergency equipment, specifically generators. In light of recent events, the board feels it may be appropriate to revisit some of our existing policies." A hand shot up immediately. It was Tom Martinez, who lived on the next street over. "I'll say they need to be revisited." My wife and I froze for 3 days because we were afraid to run our generator. We thought we'd get fined like Oliver. Another voice chimed in. "We had a pipe burst because we didn't have any way to keep the heat on. Cost us $8,000. Meanwhile, Oliver over there had the right idea and you tried to fine him for it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Brenda held up her hands, trying to regain control. "Please, everyone, one at a time. We're here to discuss this civilly and come up with a solution that works for everyone." Susan Chambers spoke up from her seat at the board table. "Perhaps we should hear from Oliver directly. He was at the center of this situation. Oliver, would you like to address the group?" I stood up, feeling dozens of eyes on me. "Thanks, Susan. Look, I don't want to make this about pointing fingers or assigning blame. What's done is done, but I do think we need to fundamentally rethink how the HOA handles emergency situations." I outlined my thoughts clearly. First, there needed to be a specific exception in the bylaws for emergency equipment operation during power outages or other crisis situations. Second, the HOA should encourage, not discourage, homeowners to prepare for emergencies. Third, there needed to be a common-sense provision that allowed the board to waive or modify rules temporarily when public safety or property protection was at stake. The point of an HOA should be to protect property values and quality of life, I concluded. But you can't do that by rigidly enforcing rules that end up causing property damage and putting people in danger. There has to be flexibility for extraordinary circumstances. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Person after person stood up to share their own stories from the freeze, expressing frustration with the existing rules and support for changes. Even Robert Mitchell, who'd been part of the delegation that threatened me, admitted that maybe they'd been too focused on the letter of the law and not enough on the spirit. Finally, it was Brenda's turn to speak. She stood slowly, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. "I owe Oliver an apology," she said quietly, and the room fell silent. "I was wrong. I was so focused on enforcing our rules that I didn't stop to consider whether those rules made sense in the circumstances we were facing. As many of you have heard, my own house suffered significant damage because I didn't take proper precautions. I was staying with a friend during the worst of the cold, and I assumed my house would be fine. I was wrong about that too." She paused, seeming to struggle with her emotions. "When I got home and found the water damage, my first thought was anger at the situation. But then I realized that Oliver had tried to warn me. He'd been trying to do the right thing, and I'd punished him for it. That's not the kind of leader this community needs." I hadn't expected such a candid admission, and judging from the surprised looks around the room, neither had anyone else. I'm proposing that we immediately amend our bylaws to include comprehensive emergency provisions, Brenda continued, her voice growing stronger. And furthermore, I think we should recognize Oliver publicly for his preparedness and for standing his ground when he knew he was right. His actions probably inspired other people to protect their own homes, even if they were worried about HOA consequences. The room erupted in applause. I felt my face flush with embarrassment, but also with satisfaction. This was exactly the outcome I'd hoped for. The rest of the meeting was spent hammering out the details of the new emergency provisions. It was agreed that during declared emergencies, whether power outages, severe weather events, or other crisis situations, homeowners would have broad latitude to operate emergency equipment, including generators, without fear of HOA penalties. The noise restrictions would be suspended, and the board would have authority to temporarily waive other rules as needed to protect health, safety, and property. Someone suggested that the HOA should even maintain a list of homeowners who had generators and other emergency equipment, so that neighbors could help each other out during future crises. Brenda embraced this idea enthusiastically, volunteering to compile and maintain the list herself. As the meeting wrapped up, people came up to shake my hand and thank me for standing my ground. Frank clapped me on the shoulder proudly, as if I were his own son who just won an award. When most people had cleared out, Brenda approached me hesitantly. Up close, I could see how much the past week had taken a toll on her. She looked exhausted and older than her years. "Oliver, I truly am sorry," she said. "I know my apology during the meeting was public, but I wanted to say it to you privately as well. I was completely out of line and you had every right to ignore me." I nodded, accepting her apology. "I appreciate you saying that. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the damage to your house. I know how stressful that must be." "It's been a nightmare," she admitted. "I finally got a plumber scheduled for next week, but then I need to deal with the drywall, the flooring, possibly some structural issues. Insurance will cover most of it, but the deductible alone is $5,000, and the house is going to be torn up for months. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know," I offered, and I meant it. Yes, she'd been awful to me, but seeing her this broken and humbled, I couldn't help but feel some compassion. She smiled weakly. "That's kind of you. Actually, there is something. I'm going to be staying with my daughter in Cincinnati while the repairs are being done. I was wondering if you might keep an eye on the place. Make sure the contractors are actually working and not just sitting around." "Of course. Happy to do that. Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You know, I've been president of this HOA for 6 years. In that time, I thought I was doing the right thing by enforcing the rules strictly. I thought that's what people wanted, what would keep property values up and maintain standards. But this whole situation made me realize I'd lost sight of why we have rules in the first place. They're supposed to serve the community, not the other way around." It was quite a philosophical turn from someone who'd been threatening to sue me just a week earlier. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to see things clearly," I said. "Indeed." She gathered her things and prepared to leave. "The new bylaws will be drafted and circulated for review within 2 weeks. I'm going to make sure they're comprehensive and actually useful. No more rigid enforcement for its own sake." After she left, I helped Frank stack chairs and clean up the clubhouse. The old man was practically giddy with how the meeting had gone. "Never thought I'd see the day when Brenda Patterson admitted she was wrong about something," he chuckled. "You did good, Oliver. Real good." Over the next few weeks, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The weather warmed up relatively speaking, as it was still January in Ohio and the various homeowners who'd suffered freeze damage began the long process of repairs. Brenda's house became something of a neighborhood spectacle, with contractors' trucks coming and going at all hours, hauling out damaged drywall and fixtures. I kept my promise to keep an eye on the place, stopping by every few days to check on progress. The damage really was extensive. The burst pipe in the master bathroom had flooded the entire second floor, causing the ceiling in the living room to partially collapse. The kitchen pipe had done significant damage to the cabinets and flooring. And the basement pipe had created a small flood that damaged the water heater and HVAC system. The plumber I spoke with, a guy named Jerry who'd been working overtime for weeks dealing with freeze-related calls, told me it was one of the worst cases he'd seen. If she just kept the heat on, even at a minimum level, this never would have happened, he said, shaking his head. People don't realize how quickly pipes can freeze in extreme cold, and once they start to thaw, that's when you get the bursts. Seen it 1,000 times. How much do you think the total damage is? I asked. Easy 25, maybe 30,000 when you factor in all the repairs, Jerry replied. And that's if they don't find any mold or additional structural issues once they open up the walls. I thought about how Brenda had been so adamant about fining me $500 a day for running my generator. The cosmic irony of her ending up with a repair bill that was 50 times more than what she tried to charge me was not lost on me. The revised HOA bylaws were circulated for comment in early February. Marcus looked them over for me and pronounced them quite reasonable. The emergency provisions were clearly written and comprehensive, covering not just generators but a wide range of emergency situations and equipment. There was even a Good Samaritan clause that protected homeowners who helped their neighbors during emergencies from liability or HOA penalties. The bylaws were put to a vote at the March meeting and passed unanimously. Brenda, who'd returned from her daughter's house by then but was still living in a partially reconstructed home, seemed genuinely pleased with the outcome. "These are bylaws I can actually feel good about enforcing," she told me after the meeting. Or rather, not enforcing when it doesn't make sense to enforce them. I was glad to see she'd maintained her changed perspective even after the immediate crisis had passed. Some people, when they experience humility, tend to snap back to their old ways once they've recovered. But Brenda seemed to have genuinely learned from the experience. In April, once Brenda's house was finally fully repaired and she was back living there full-time, she threw a neighborhood barbecue to thank everyone for their patience and support during the construction chaos. It was a surprisingly warm spring day, and a good portion of Meadowbrook Estates turned out. I brought Sarah, who'd returned from her extended visit to Phoenix, and heard all about the drama she'd missed. She couldn't believe her mild-mannered husband had gone toe-to-toe with the infamous Brenda Patterson. "I leave you alone for 1 week," she teased, "and you start a revolution." "Hardly a revolution," I protested, "just standing up for common sense." At the barbecue, Brenda made another small speech, thanking everyone and reiterating her commitment to sensible HOA leadership going forward. She also presented me with a plaque that read, "To Oliver Kensington, for exemplifying preparedness, good neighboring, and standing firm for what's right. Thank you for making Meadowbrook Estates a better community." It was cheesy and over the top, but I had to admit I was touched. Frank started a round of applause, and I accepted the plaque with good grace. "Just glad we could turn a bad situation into something positive," I said when the applause died down. "And I hope everyone learned a lesson about preparing for emergencies. Next time a polar vortex or ice storm hits, I want to see generators running up and down this street." that got a laugh and more applause. The party continued well into the evening, with neighbors mingling and sharing stories. The whole vibe of the community felt different, somehow more connected, more willing to help each other out. Crisis had forged relationships that might not have existed otherwise. As Sarah and I walked home that evening, my ridiculous plaque tucked under my arm, she squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not many people would have stood their ground like that." "Someone had to," I replied. And honestly, I think Brenda needed to be challenged. She'd been operating in an echo chamber for so long, just doing things the way she'd always done them without questioning whether they still made sense. Sometimes it takes someone pushing back to force that reevaluation. True. And hey, at least you got a plaque out of it, I laughed. Yeah, this thing is definitely going in the garage. Looking back on the whole experience now, several months removed from the frigid January nights and the confrontations with an angry HOA president, I can see it as a valuable learning experience. Not just for me, though I certainly learned about the importance of standing up for yourself and not backing down when you know you're right, but also for Brenda, who learned that leadership isn't about rigid rule enforcement, but about serving the best interests of the community. And for Meadowbrook Estates as a whole, which learned that sometimes the rules need to change to reflect reality. The revised bylaws have already proven their worth. During a severe thunderstorm in May that knocked out power for 8 hours, several homeowners ran their generators without any complaint or penalty. A couple people who didn't have generators were invited to share power with neighbors who did, creating a real sense of community cooperation that wouldn't have existed under the old regime. Frank told me recently that he'd never seen the HOA function better than it has under Brenda's reformed leadership. She's still detail-oriented and organized, but now she applies those traits with actual wisdom and flexibility. She's been known to actually waive fines or grant exceptions when circumstances warrant, something that would have been unthinkable before the polar vortex incident. As for me, I keep my generator maintained and ready to go at a moment's notice. I've also put together emergency kits and plans for various scenarios, and I've shared my preparations with several neighbors who have asked for advice. Some people have jokingly started calling me the neighborhood prepper, but I don't mind. When the next emergency hits, and there will always be a next emergency, I'll be ready. And so will much of Meadowbrook Estates, which is exactly how it should be. The plaque Brenda gave me did end up in the garage, mounted on the wall right next to where I store the generator. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of that insane week when a simple act of preparedness turned into a neighborhood battle and ultimately resulted in positive change. I'm reminded that standing up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient or potentially costly, is always worth it in the end. And I'm reminded that people can change. Brenda Patterson went from being a caricature of an inflexible HOA tyrant to being a reasonable, thoughtful leader who actually cares about her community. That transformation didn't happen because I fought with her or humiliated her. It happened because circumstances forced her to see the consequences of her actions, and she had the integrity to admit she was wrong and do better. Not everyone would have had that integrity. Many people, when confronted with evidence that they've been wrong, double down and dig in deeper. The fact that Brenda was willing to stand in front of the entire community and apologize, to admit fault and commit to change, says something important about her character. She may have been wrong about the generator, but she was right about wanting to serve her community. She just needed to recalibrate her understanding of what that service should look like. These days, when I see Brenda around the neighborhood, we exchange friendly waves and occasional conversations. There's no lingering animosity, no grudge held on either side. We've become, if not friends exactly, then certainly friendly acquaintances who respect each other. She knows I'll speak up if I think the HOA is overstepping, and I know she'll actually listen now when concerns are raised. The whole experience taught me something important about community dynamics. HOAs get a bad reputation, often deservedly so, because they can become vehicles for petty tyrants to exercise control over their neighbors. But they don't have to be that way. An HOA can be a positive force for maintaining neighborhood standards and organizing community activities, as long as it's run with common sense, flexibility, and genuine concern for homeowners' well-being. Meadowbrook Estates is a better place now than it was before the polar vortex. The crisis exposed flaws in how we operated, and instead of just papering over those flaws, we actually fixed them. The revised bylaws are better. The HOA leadership is better. And the sense of community is stronger because we've all been through something difficult together and came out the other side. I also think about the broader lessons here. How often in life do we stick to rules or procedures or ways of doing things simply because that's how we've always done it, without stopping to ask whether those rules still serve their intended purpose? How often do we prioritize form over substance, process over outcomes? The HOA's noise restrictions on generators made sense in normal times. Nobody wants to live next to someone running loud machinery all day for no good reason. But during a genuine emergency, those restrictions became counterproductive and even dangerous. The ability to recognize when circumstances have changed enough to warrant a different approach is crucial, whether we're talking about HOA bylaws or any other aspect of life. Wisdom isn't about knowing all the right rules. It's about knowing when to follow the rules and when to recognize that the rules need to change. I shared this whole story with Marcus over beers one evening, and he had an interesting legal perspective on it. The law is full of bright-line rules, he explained. Speed limits, filing deadlines, statutes of limitations. These rules exist because we need certainty and predictability. But the law also recognizes equity, the principle that sometimes strict application of rules leads to unjust outcomes. That's why we have judicial discretion, emergency exceptions, force majeure clauses. Your HOA situation was a perfect example of why equity matters. The rule said no generators, but equity said that protecting property during an emergency overrides that rule. It was a more intellectual framework than I'd been thinking in, but it made sense. The conflict between Brenda and me wasn't just personal. It was a conflict between rigid rule following and equitable flexibility. The fact that our community ultimately came down on the side of flexibility and common sense was, in Marcus's view, a small victory for the principle of equity. Sarah had her own take on it. I think it's about empathy, she said. Brenda couldn't or wouldn't put herself in your shoes and imagine what you were dealing with. She was so focused on her role as rule enforcer that she lost sight of the human element. Once she experienced the consequences herself, the frozen pipes, the damage, the expense, suddenly she could understand what you'd been trying to prevent. That's when things changed. Both perspectives were valid, and they weren't mutually exclusive. The situation had legal, philosophical, and deeply human dimensions. That's what made it so interesting to think about, even months after the fact. One unexpected outcome of the whole affair was that I became somewhat involved in HOA governance myself. At the annual election in June, several people approached me about running for the board. I was reluctant at first. I didn't have time to take on major new commitments, but eventually I agreed to run for one of the 3 open positions. I won easily, which I think says something about how the community viewed my handling of the generator controversy. My platform, such as it was, focused on common sense governance, transparency, and maintaining the positive changes we'd implemented in the wake of the polar vortex. Serving on the board has been interesting. I've gained a new appreciation for how much work goes into running an HOA, even a relatively small one like ours. There are budgets to manage, contractors to hire, disputes to mediate, and endless small decisions to make about everything from landscaping to playground equipment. Brenda, as president, handles the lion's share of this work, and she does it well. Working with her has shown me yet another side of her personality. She's organized, efficient, and genuinely cares about making Meadowbrook Estates a nice place to live. Yes, she can still be a little intense sometimes, but now that intensity is channeled productively rather than being used to terrorize people over minor rule violations. We've had a few interesting cases come before the board since I joined. One homeowner wanted to install solar panels, which weren't explicitly addressed in our bylaws. The old Brenda probably would have said no simply, because they weren't on the list of approved modifications. But the new Brenda led a discussion about the benefits of renewable energy and how solar panels might actually increase property values and align with broader environmental goals. We ended up approving the installation with some reasonable aesthetic guidelines to ensure it didn't look terrible. Another situation involved a family who wanted to build a wheelchair ramp for their elderly father who was moving in with them. Again, not explicitly covered by the bylaws, and the ramp would technically violate setback requirements. But it was obviously the right thing to do, both from a compassionate and a legal standpoint. Denying a disability accommodation would have been a violation of fair housing laws. We approved it unanimously and fast-tracked the process so construction could begin quickly. These kinds of decisions wouldn't have been possible under the old regime, or at least they would have been much more difficult and contentious. The culture shift that began with my generator standoff has permeated the entire HOA operation. We're focused on serving homeowners rather than policing them, on facilitating reasonable requests rather than looking for reasons to say no. Of course, we still enforce actual important rules. If someone wants to paint their house fluorescent orange or let their lawn turn into a jungle, we're going to have a conversation about that. If someone's chronically parking on the street in violation of our parking rules, or if they're running a business out of their home that creates constant traffic and noise, those are legitimate concerns that the HOA needs to address. But we've gotten much better at distinguishing between rules that matter and rules that are just bureaucratic nonsense. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd backed down when Brenda first confronted me about the generator. If I'd been less confident in my position or more worried about rocking the boat, I might have turned it off. My pipes probably would have frozen, just like hers did. I'd be out thousands of dollars in repairs, and the broader community would have missed an opportunity to reform dysfunctional governance. It's a reminder that standing up for yourself and for what's right doesn't just benefit you personally, it can create positive change that ripples outward to benefit many others. If I'd been the only person with a generator, the only person affected by Brenda's rigid interpretation of the rules, maybe the outcome would have been different. But because my actions highlighted a systemic problem that affected the entire community, they led to systemic reform. That's something I try to keep in mind now that I'm on the other side, helping to make decisions rather than challenging them. Are we creating rules and policies that serve the community's genuine interests? Are we being flexible enough to account for changing circumstances and individual situations? Are we treating homeowners as partners in maintaining a great neighborhood, or as subjects to be controlled? These questions matter, and asking them regularly helps ensure we don't slide back into the kind of authoritarian, inflexible governance that characterized the HOA before the polar vortex incident. As I write this, we're approaching the one-year anniversary of that brutal cold snap. The weather forecasters are predicting a much milder winter this year, but I'm prepared regardless. My generator is fueled up and maintained, my emergency supplies are stocked, and I've reviewed my home winterization checklist. Several of my neighbors have followed suit, having learned from last year's experience. There's even been talk about the HOA purchasing a large commercial generator that could be shared among multiple houses during extended outages. Brenda's been researching options and costs, and it might actually happen. The fact that we're even having that conversation, the HOA facilitating emergency preparedness rather than penalizing it, shows how far we've come. I think back to that moment standing in my doorway at 7 in the morning, Brenda demanding that I turn off my generator while the temperature was negative 12 degrees. I was angry, frustrated, and somewhat afraid of the consequences of defying her. But I knew I was right, and I trusted that truth would prevail eventually. It did prevail, though not without some stress and conflict along the way. And the victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone in Meadowbrook Estates who benefited from the reformed bylaws and improved HOA governance. That's what makes the whole experience feel worthwhile, even the unpleasant parts. Frank still likes to tell the story to anyone who will listen, usually with embellishments that make me sound more heroic than I actually was. According to his version, I stood up to the HOA tyrant and brought down her reign of terror, which is a bit dramatic but not entirely inaccurate. He's proud of his role in the story too, as the neighbor who needed help and who provided historical context about Brenda's evolution into an HOA dictator. The Martinez family, whose pipes froze because they were afraid to run their generator, sends me a Christmas card every year now with a note thanking me for fighting the good fight. The Smiths, who had the burst pipe in their bathroom, made a point of voting for me in the board election. These small gestures of appreciation mean more to me than any plaque or formal recognition, because at the end of the day, this whole saga wasn't really about me or my generator, or even about Brenda Patterson specifically. It was about a community coming together to recognize and fix a problem, about people choosing cooperation and common sense over rigid adherence to counterproductive rules. It was about learning and growth, both individual and collective. Brenda learned that leadership requires wisdom and flexibility, not just the ability to enforce regulations. The community learned that challenging authority isn't disrespectful if that authority is being exercised unwisely. In fact, it's a necessary part of maintaining healthy governance. And I learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular, can create positive change far beyond what you initially imagined. These lessons have applications well beyond HOA politics. In our workplaces, our families, our civic institutions, we constantly encounter situations where we have to choose between going along with the status quo or speaking up for change. It's not always easy to speak up. There are risks involved, social, professional, sometimes even financial. But the cost of staying silent can be even higher. If I'd stayed silent and turned off my generator, I'd have damaged property, wasted money on repairs, and missed an opportunity to help my community. If others had stayed silent when they saw the HOA's rules leading to bad outcomes, nothing would have changed. Collective silence preserves dysfunctional systems. Individual voices, when raised at the right time and in the right way, can shatter those systems and create space for something better. I'm not suggesting everyone should become a rebel who challenges every rule and authority figure they encounter. Most rules exist for good reasons, and most authority figures are trying their best to serve their communities or organizations. But when you encounter rules that don't make sense, that cause more harm than good, that prioritize process over purpose, those are the rules worth challenging. And when you encounter leaders who are more concerned with control than with service, more focused on their own authority than on the well-being of those they are supposed to serve, those are the leaders worth standing up to. The key is to challenge respectfully but firmly, to base your challenge on principle rather than personal animosity, and to stay focused on the substantive issues rather than getting distracted by interpersonal drama. I never attacked Brenda personally, never tried to embarrass or humiliate her. I simply insisted that my position was correct and that I wouldn't back down regardless of the threats she made. That approach gave her room to eventually change her mind without losing too much face, which turned out to be crucial for the positive resolution we ultimately achieved. As I sit here reflecting on everything that happened, I feel a sense of gratitude for the experience, as strange as that might sound. I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to make a difference in my community. I'm grateful that Brenda had the integrity to admit she was wrong and change course. I'm grateful for neighbors like Frank who supported me throughout the ordeal. And I'm grateful for the reminder that individual actions matter, that one person standing up for what's right can spark broader change. The portable generator sitting in my garage represents more than just emergency preparedness equipment. It's a symbol of the importance of thinking ahead, of not being afraid to be different, and of standing firm in your convictions even when powerful people tell you you're wrong. Every time I run it for a maintenance check, I think about those frigid January nights and the battle that followed. And I smile, knowing that something good came out of that difficult experience. Meadowbrook Estates is a better community because of what happened. The HOA is better. The relationships between neighbors are stronger. And I like to think I'm a better person too, more confident in my judgment and more willing to speak up when something isn't right. Those are all outcomes worth celebrating, and they all trace back to a simple decision to keep my generator running despite being told not to. So here's to portable generators, to frozen pipes, to HOA Karens who learn important lessons, and to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refuse to back down from what's right. It's been quite a year in Meadowbrook Estates, and I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Well, maybe I'd trade it for not having had to deal with the stress and conflict at the time. But looking back now, with the perspective that time and positive outcomes provide, I can see it all as part of a valuable journey that made our little corner of Columbus, Ohio, a better place to call home.